Greetings in the name of our living Savior. My name is Cleopus, and I want to tell you what happened to my wife and me on the Passover Sabbath. On the Sabbath, we were walking on the road to Emmaus, making our way home. Of course, the conversation went back to the events of the weekend. Why, we kept asking. Why was this good man, this man whom we thought to be the Messiah, put to death? It was such an incredibly burdensome question. My whole body felt depressed. I don't know when I've ever felt so distraught, so disconnected with my surroundings, so unwilling to accept the reality of recent events. After what seemed like an eternity, I glanced past my wife and noticed that there was another person walking with us. I must admit, I was a bit irritated by this stranger's presence. Too wrapped up in my own sorrow, I wanted to continue talking to my wife about our grief and disappointment. Fortunately for me, this man was sensitive to the sadness in our faces, our eyes, our drooping posture. So instead of talking about something that I didn't want to talk about, he posed just the right question. "What are you talking about that makes you so sad?" he inquired. I felt a rush of blood to my face and was overcome with anguish once again. Frankly, I felt the stranger should have known. How could anybody not know what had happened on that awful Friday? I looked up at the stranger and said, "Are you the only person in town that doesn't know what's been happening? We just suffered the greatest loss of our lives. For 3 years, we have traveled off and on with Jesus of Nazareth, a prophet who continually did wonderful things for all people. He seemed the favorite of God as well as man. We were sure he would deliver all of Israel from the Roman yoke. But this past weekend, the chief priests and rulers of Rome condemned him and put him to death. It's been so confusing because if there was ever a person who was to be anointed king, it was Jesus. And just today, we've heard rumors that his buried body has disappeared. There's even a report that some of the women from our group went to his tomb, found that it was empty, and were told by some angels that Jesus is alive. Can you imagine? It has to be wishful thinking. After all, we saw him dead with our own eyes. Well, it's all over now, so we're just going to go home and try to put our lives back together again." Then the stranger looked right into my eyes and said something I couldn't understand. "You know," he said, "you really are a very forgetful person. Don't you remember the prophets taught that the true Messiah was not someone who was to overthrow Rome and set up a political kingdom? The true Messiah was to first suffer and then enter into the glory of the kingdom, a kingdom that is not of this world." I was amazed at his answer. For some reason, I felt this stranger didn't understand what was going on. But then, as we continued to walk, he began to interpret the scriptures of Moses and all the prophets. I still remember vividly his comments about the need for the Messiah to suffer. I didn't completely understand it, but for some unexplainable reason, it sounded right to me. So I listened intently as the stranger went on to tell me a side of the story that literally made my heart burn within me. "You know," he said, "the suffering of the Messiah was for you," he said. "He went to his death like a lamb to the slaughter." As we continued to walk the Emmaus road, the stranger began to tell us more. "I've told you the bad news," he said. "Now, let me tell you the good news." As he was speaking, I couldn't grasp the full impact of the good news, but somehow I knew he was speaking the truth. I felt his words on the inside, and a healing calm swept from my heart to every part of my body. We were not far from home. As we drew near, it was obvious our companion had further to go. It was late at night, and even though I didn't know much about this man, I felt he understood me and grasped our despair. I asked the stranger if he'd like to stay the night in our home. He obliged our request, and we all entered the house and walked into the kitchen. It had been a long, arduous journey and a wrenching emotional experience. Being physically and emotionally exhausted, I walked over to the cupboard and pulled out a bottle of wine, a loaf of bread, some nuts, and dried fruit. Our new friend, however, walked over to the table and stood in my place, the place of the host. I watched in amazement as this fellow traveler picked up the loaf of bread, lifted it above his head, and prayed the Jewish prayer over bread that I had prayed 1,000 times. I knew these words by heart, but for some reason, the way he said these words made me feel he understood something about this blessing that I didn't. The passion and conviction in his voice as he spoke these words pulled at the very strings of my heart. I looked up and concentrated my attention on his hands, tightly wrapped around both ends of the loaf. They had the appearance of having been mauled, but they were beautiful, sturdy, strong hands. He broke the bread, dividing it into two. The break was gentle, but what I saw in my mind's eye was violent. It was as though the bread was assaulted and abused, torn viciously and crushed unmercifully. Suddenly, the bread was no longer bread. It was the body of Jesus. The memory of his horribly excruciating death returned vividly. My eyes dropped to the uplifted face of the traveler. His face was lit like the sun, and I saw angels all around who were singing. In that instant, I knew our guest was no ordinary man. The stranger in our midst was the resurrected Jesus. An involuntary voice came rushing out of my inner being, and I heard myself cry, "It's Jesus! He's alive again!" My knees gave way, and I literally slumped to the floor. I looked up again to see Jesus, but he was gone, vanished from my sight. A flood of emotions pulsated through my body. Once again, the good news came to the surface. By his wounds, you are healed. Yes, I shouted, yes, yes, his kingdom, his rule is right here in my heart. He rules me and all others who put their trust in him. He is Lord. My wife looked right into my eyes and spoke my name. "Cleopus," she said, "we have to return to Jerusalem and tell the disciples we've seen the resurrected Jesus." We arrived in Jerusalem, dashed hurriedly up the steps, burst through the door and cried, "He's risen! The Lord is risen indeed, for we knew him in the breaking of the bread." As one man, the disciples rose and hurried to our side. Tell us what you've seen." Just as we were describing how we had recognized Jesus in the breaking of the bread, all of a sudden, there he was, Jesus. He just appeared among us. We all fell to his feet, babbling questions in a jumble of chaotic words. "Jesus, what's going on? Tell us the meaning of all this." In the middle of all the frenzy, I heard Jesus ask, "Do you have any food?" Into my mind came the revelation in the breaking of the bread. My heart pounding, I could sense what was to come. We all ate together, and once again I listened to the words of Jesus, healing my heart and bringing life to my soul. Well, as you know, I'm a member of the Church of Jerusalem. Every time we gather to worship, we break bread. And Jesus, the resurrected Jesus, shows up to touch us, to heal us, and once again, to make us whole.